This is Gene Lance on the Workers Beat Extra. And today I got a chance to talk to Carol Travis. I just met you, Carol, and when they said your name was Travis, I started thinking, could she be related to Bob Travis, who is in all the history books, passing in and out, but they never tell who he is or anything more about him. What's your relationship?
I'm his only child. He had me when he was like 37. So I'm 78 now.
Mm-hmm.
He was born in 1905, I think. There was always a dispute about when he was born because he changed his age a couple of times when he was young to work in the plants.
To get the job.
Yeah.
So this was during the Depression when he started working in the automobile industry, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then the first time I hear about him is he was in the Autolite fight. He didn't work
Yes.
at Autolite, but he was part of their picket organizing, right?
Yes, he was. And he tells a story about it that I tried to find in the Toledo Blade archives, and I never really tracked it down. But the story he told me, he told it to me, and he cried after he told it. And I'll tell you the story.
Great.
He said, or this is when he cried. There was the strike was going on, and they were losing, and the amalgamated local that he was part of, even though he wasn't at Autolite, he was at one of the other places that was represented by the amalgamated local, and they decided on a Thursday that they would have to do something dramatic for the following Monday because things were getting weren't moving. So they leafleted all over the area, not just Toledo, but the surrounding areas. And they just sent out a lot of information to please come and support the strikers on Monday. And so Monday, thousands of people showed up and circled the plant. And that's when he kind of cried. He said, sometimes people surprise you. This is one of those times. Anyway, so they circled the plant, and then the police came out, and I don't know if it was the National Guard. I think it was just police or whatever. Anyway, a line of police amassed across the street from the plant and across the street from the picketers. And he was going down the picket line talking to people, and a gun went off, and the man standing next to him was hit in the stomach. And so, it created this horrible moment of tension and fear and so on. And so the workers got the man and took him away and so on, but there was like real tension in the air. And the mayor, he told me, of Toledo, came out into the middle of the street waving a handkerchief. And so my father went out to meet him, and he said the mayor was talking blah, 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 like this. He was shaking and was because he was afraid that there was going to be a total riot and a bloodbath. And so my father said to him, "You order all of your men to stand still, and I'm going to go down the line of the cops and smell everybody's weapon. So you order them right now just to hope." And so he did, and that kind of diffused the situation because the strikers were being in charge in that sense of what was continuing and had some authority. And I don't, he didn't, he said the man survived, the man who was hit. And he said he never found he said, of course, I never found the weapon that was discharged, but it diffused the situation. Anyway, that was one story, one of a million stories.
The Toledo auto strike was the first sit down in America, was it not?
There was also a, now my memory is fading. There was another sit down at an electrical plant. I want to say Marshall's, but I don't think it's it. But there was one other, but it may be that Autolite was first and that was second and so on. And Flint came later. It really came from the French. The French were doing sit-down strikes, and activists who were connected to international consciousness and movements were told about, what was going on in other countries and workers' movements, because people cared,
Mm-hmm. And at that time, it was really dangerous. Now we're talking about actually before the CIO was started, or at least before it became the Congress of Industrial Organizations.
Yeah.
It may have been a committee for industrial organizing back in those days.
It was mostly AFL, and it was an amalgamated AFL local. And it was dangerous. There's another time, which is later, when he was in Flint, where he was driving from Flint, I think, to Kalamazoo, and he was in a car. He had a car for the union, and some guys ran him off the road, and got him out of the car, took his car keys, threw his car keys in a cornfield, and were, jostling him. And he went into the cornfield to get the keys, and they began shooting at him. And he, to make him kind of jump and stuff, but they were kind of getting wound up. And a woman came along in a car and stopped when she saw this. And she got out of the car and she said, "What's going on here?" And the man left. And he considered that woman somebody who saved his life, because it was an escalating game they were playing with him. Another time he was beaten so badly he was blind for 3 days in the hospital. But yes, it was a dangerous time.
That's when he worked for General Motors at Flint?
That's when he was organizing in Flint, yes. Yeah.
Everybody thinks Walter Reuther ran the strike at Flint that got the General Motors, that got the UAW started. But that's not true, is it?
No, Walter had nothing to do with it. Victor had some things to do with it, and so did the other brother. I want to say Alan,
Roy.
but it's not Alan, because Roy.
Mm-hmm.
Alan is Roy's son. But Roy, right. Roy and Victor had things to do with the strike. But my father was the designated official director and was really the leader. And Victor would even say that to me. Victor told me a story about my father when I was in Flint at the 50th anniversary of the strike, where there was a big parade, and or the year of the strike. It wasn't in the winter. And it was the first time I met Victor. And so he and Sophie took me under their wing. I was president of my local already, the 719 locomotive, General Motors local already. But they took me under their wing. I think, and what Victor said to me is, your father had a very unusual style of speaking. And I said, really? Yeah, I never noticed. And he said, no, I mean to crowds. He said there were some very important meetings where in Pegley Hall, which was the hall in Flint where the UAW met, he would sit at the edge of the stage in a chair and talk to these big crowds as if he was in the living room with each one of them individually.
Really?
And one of the more famous meetings is he laid out the problem that they were having. It was near the end of the strike, and it had been going on for a month, and the Black Legion was doing a lot of work, and there was a lot of work.
The Black
being done.
Legion, that would be the equivalent of the Ku Klux Klan or the Nazis.
Yeah, yeah. And so they were doing a lot of work against the strikers. And it was a long time. And so people had been without paychecks a long time. And even though there was a lot of various organizing and food distribution and clothes and all kinds of things like that. And also a drugstore chain, Hurlick's, which I don't know if it's still there. It was there in the 60s, gave prescriptions on would fill the prescriptions and you would sign, and later they would collect, but anyway, so Victor said he would sit at the edge of the thing and indicate the problems and where we were. And he said, somehow your father had the ability to engender a sense of people who lived in little huts under in the shadow of this gigantic behemoth, which was legendary. What's good for General Motors is good for the USA, sort of thing, and convince them that together that they had the power to confront. And he said that I don't know how he did it, but he did that. And so that was one of the stories that Victor told me.
That's really high praise, because Victor Reuther is famous for his oratorical abilities.
Well, he was saying that what Victor does was, the big get out there, and he said your father did something else, which was a different and not traditional labor rousing speech, but one that appealed to people's intelligence and so forth. I mean, I think he must have been speaking about particularly, there was a meeting which led to the takeover on, I think it was February 1st. I haven't looked at all of this lately, except you've inspired me to start looking at it. And Tony, I went to the thing because of Tony Gilpin. But this was the meeting where he said to people, among many other things, we're at a critical moment, and we've got stool pigeons here. We've got stool pigeons operating here, and we have to do some things, and we need to have your authority. Will you give a small committee of people authority to act on your behalf? Mm-hmm. And he did some things. And in that meeting also, they exposed a few spies, a few stool pigeons, because Charlie Johnson, who worked for La Follette, Charlie Johnson was in the party, and he was a staff of Senator La Follette's, and La Follette was the head of a Senate Labor Committee, and he had sent Charlie in there. And Charlie was
La Follette was a senator from the Progressive
Wisconsin
Farmer Labor Party, right?
I don't know if he was from Farmer Labor or what, but he was a senator, United States senator from Wisconsin.
Right, but Farmer Labor supported him, and
yeah,
and this other guy, Charlie, was in the Communist Party, but he was working
Yes,
with all.
but he worked for La Follette. I don't think, he did those guys didn't walk around saying I'm a commie. They didn't talk about that because
Right.
it was
They were
not.
doing their work.
They were doing their work, and there were people from the Socialist Party, the Communist Party. They were all involved in these things.
And the Mustyites. The
And what?
Mustyites were there.
The Mustyites, yes. I have a picture of Musty. No, that's Norman Thomas. Where's the Musty? Anyway, uh, anyway, yes. And it's a picture of Norman Thomas, John Lewis, and James Foreman
I
from
see.
a long time ago. Anyway,
So at that time, there were several progressive organizations helping the labor movement.
yes,
All of whom got kicked out later on.
yes, yes. And my prejudice here is, and this isn't because I grew up as an active CP person. I did not. My mother was a New Deal Democrat. So, there was this whatever, and they divorced. So, but in studying it, the Communist Party did it. And the Communist Party was huge, relatively speaking,
Right.
in those days.
The
And
most
so,
important point, I want to be very, very clear on this for people that are listening, is that the Flint sit-down strike, which was the turning point
right,
in American labor history,
yeah,
was led by a man named Robert Travis,
yes,
a man whose fame is hardly known at all. The
right,
only reason you know the name is not because anybody ever explains how important it was, but only because he keeps turning up. He's like Carl Brannon in the Socialist Party. Nobody knows exactly who he is or what he did, but his name just keeps turning up. Things happened, and he was there.
right.
He said he organized local unions for the United Auto Workers after
Yeah.
Flint.
Yes, he did. And although a lot of the ones that he organized, that some were UAW locals and some were farm equipment locals, and FE was like UE. UE is the only one survived. I think there might have been another E, but and UE was United Electrical Workers, and FE was farm equipment workers.
FE was farm equipment. And they had John
Deere.
Caterpillar.
Right, exactly.
Both of those are part of the Auto Workers Union now, and
yes.
Nobody knows why. How did that happen?
Well, they merged, and actually, again, I haven't been looking at this stuff lately, so I can't give you the dates, but there was an argument about whether or not they should merge. And actually, my father was in favor of merger when it happened. My father was didn't have a sliver of sectarianism in him. I should correct that. Later, he began to really be angry with Walter.
This is in his later life.
Yeah, and Walter wrote him out of history, and he signed Walter and Victor's first union cards when they showed up.
He signed them up
at a convention in Muncie. They had just come back from the Soviet Union, and they showed up, and my father signed their first cards.
So Bob Travis recruited Victor and Walter Reuther to the Auto Workers Union.
Well, I think probably the movement recruited them, but he had a position in the organizing group that had him sign their union cards. Okay. So, and my father was the first person who led a strike that won against General Motors. It was in Toledo, before Flint. And that's one of the reasons he was chosen. Another reason was he was very charming. He's really a nice man. He had a great laugh, a great smile. He was warm-hearted, Herlick, the head of the drugstore chain, told me when I was about 13 a story about my father. He said, during the strike, your father came into the drugstore and there was a man shivering because it was snowing and freezing who was picking up a prescription for his wife. And your father said, don't you have a coat? And the guy said, no, I don't have a coat. And your father gave him his coat, so that was the kind of person he was. So he was, so there was that reason. I was on some jag there and I lost my train of thought. But
Well, that's very good. What a story.
oh, there's a lot of stories like that. I mean,
You've got to put
a wonderful laugh. He had
got to put this together.
Oh, I know what. Another sidebar is the book called Red Diaper Babies, and I'm not in it. But one woman.
You should explain what red diaper babies are.
Okay, that means kids who were born to communist families, because in those days, communists were called Reds. And so children of communists were called red diaper babies. So there's a book called Red Diaper Babies, and it's a collection of stories. And one of the stories is from a woman whose name I don't recall, of course, and she's now dead apparently. But it's about Detroit, and I always lived in Chicago. I visited my father in Flint and Detroit and here and there, all in Michigan, because he lived in Michigan for many years. And when I was alive, and he and my mother were divorced, and then he moved to California. But in this book, it says, being the child of communists in the 50s was really a unpleasant experience because of McCarthy and so on. So everyone was always frightened and down and miserable, except for Bob Travis, who used to, on Sundays, come and round up a lot of kids and take us to the park. And he always had a smile and a laugh, and he didn't care. And he was, so that's the kind of person he was. He was immediately likable, is what I would say.
Why is it, in your opinion, that everybody doesn't know about Bob Travis and doesn't celebrate the life of this man that made such a gigantic contribution to American labor history?
Well, I think that I was thinking the other day in general about the United States because of what's going on and the divisions and the white working class, sectors of it really being drawn to Trump for reasons which I have some understanding of. I know we're way over 10 minutes, dear. But I think because we're a country of immigrants and from different countries and different cultures and so on, in a lot of ways, we never did melt as a melting pot, or we did to some degree, but to some degree we didn't. And also, the people who probably immigrated were probably not, were a certain kind of entrepreneurial, adventurous person who could take a risk and go, so they were individualists in a lot of ways. So it's a country of strong individuals. And so class consciousness, when it was really hammered quite consciously by the powers that be, for many years, nobody said working class. I mean, everybody said middle.
They've only just started saying it now.
Just started saying it again. It was like it was a banned. I think that people who are younger than I am, and I know you're younger than I am, but people who are younger than at least I am, knew that at some point it was not to be said. And then I think generations after it, it never occurred to them. They never heard it. So it wasn't a banned word, but it was an absent concept. And
so our labor heroes were part of that vacuum that just got sucked in
Well, there's that,
Not discussed.
and ones that were particularly communists
Mhm.
were carefully written out of history.
Well, a lot of them were
Intentionally.
communists, weren't they?
A lot were communists. I mean, Emil Macy, who was the first secretary treasurer, I don't think he was a member of a party, but he was very friendly to my father, and he sent a movie, which got lost somewhere along the way, of some of the footage of the strike, and I think probably the Battle of Bull Run, and some as a gift, you know. So and and actually at one of the conventions, I think it was 74 convention, they set up a special pension for my father.
Really?
Yeah, it was. It wasn't. I can't remember who was the president then.
74? Woodcock.
It was Woodcock. It was Leonard. It was Leonard, and but and Dave Miller was the head of the retirees thing at that point, and he and Woodcock, and they introduced my father to the convention.
Really?
My father made a speech at the convention, and I regret, whenever I think of it, my role in that, because he wrote a speech that was the names of all the people who were not remembered. You know, it was Joe Ditzel and oh, I can't remember the other guy's name, from Toledo. So and Mortimer, Wyndham Mortimer, and you know, just numbers.
Nobody knows who Wyndham Mortimer was.
Right. Nobody knows who.
That's
And his story.
absolutely not
And
known.
he is a wonder. He was my father's mentor. My father loved Mort and learned a lot from Mort, and always gave Mort credit for teaching him many things. And Mortimer was quite a bit older than my father, and so his speech was going to be a list of all of these names. And I said to him, nobody's going to know who these people are. When do you know, you're wasting your time listing their names. Why don't you say something about politics or that? So I convinced him not to do that.
Oh.
Terrible. Just horrible, you know. Years later, I looked back on that. Somebody gave me a book, you know, they have the transcript of all the convention stuff. And I was in Detroit, well, as a president of the local, then I was part of the GM council, blah, blah, blah. So I got to go here and there and do things. And somebody was showing me the transcript, the book of the transcript of that convention. And I read his speech and I was just like, oh, how terrible was I? It was terrible.
I'd love to see
Because he
that.
wanted to name all those wonderful people, all those
I'd love to
Bud
see that.
Simons, Dorothy Krause, Henry Krause, but other people too. There were,
Henry Krause
I
wrote a
met,
couple of books.
pardon?
Henry Krause wrote a couple of books about the
Yes,
workers.
Henry did. And Dorothy was part of the Women's Brigade and
At Flint.
at Flint, which was very important. And in fact, but you know, if you write history, then you're remembered. Like Janora Johnson wrote, and so she becomes Howard Zinn's understanding of what happened at Flint because she wrote a book about herself and her husband, Kermit. And, you know, so if you want to be remembered, you got to write a book. Unless whatever, unless the bourgeois historians, you know,
Another thing
revere your name.
Another thing that people don't know about Flint is that it wasn't just a sit-in. It wasn't the first sit-in. It was probably the most important one.
Right.
But that there were other strategies and tactics employed of a military level
Yes.
that caused the victory when
Yes.
really they were up against everything. They were up against the whole
Yes.
society, the Black
Right.
Legions, the governor.
Except for the governor.
Yeah, but
Governor Murphy.
he had to come around.
He he had just been elected, and he actually didn't take office until after the strike was underway.
But he was
But
under pressure to call out the troops.
right, and then he
when
did.
He didn't.
No, he did, but he called them out to protect the strikers
Oh, I see.
and to not have any mayhem. So he called them out in a way that protected the strikers from the Pinkerton.
I see. The Pinkerton
So-
Detective Agency is a noted scab running, strike breaking organization.
Right.
Mhm.
And they had control of the local before Mort got there.
I see.
It was a very small local, even there were 47,000 General Motors workers in Flint. In fact, when my father first showed up at Flint, they said, we want to send you to Flint and take over from Mort. And he had, he was the president of Local 4 in Toledo, which was one of the first UAW locals, 1, 2, 3, 4, And actually, I became very good friends with the then president when I was a president of Local 4. And he took me to Toledo. I went to Toledo, and he showed me my dad's picture was up there with Walter and Owen Bieber at that time. So it was my dad, Walter, and Owen Bieber. But anyway, he drove up to Flint. My dad drove up to Flint, and at shift changing time, he thought, "Oh my God, what am I going to do here? This is huge population of people. How are we going to organize it?" Well, Mort encouraged him, and also Mort realized when he was up there earlier that the local was run by stool pigeons.
Right.
And so that people who joined the union were fired. That's why it was a very small, non-functional union.
So he had to organize in secret, and he had to actually go around the local that was already there.
Right. And Mort Mort arranged with Addis, not with Homer Martin, who was the president, who was a flake and a weird guy. But anyway, to send the names and the dues directly to Addis, so that nobody else saw.
The secretary of the UAW.
Yeah.
At the time.
Right. I mean, there was a very small group of guys, and there was tensions among them because there were different ideologies in that small group of guys. But in the beginning there, the Ruthers were not big shots at all. Walter was not a big shot.
It was it was Wyndham Mortimer who nominated Walter Reuther to become to get on the executive board.
I didn't know
that's
that.
in his book.
But I didn't remember it anyway. But yeah, but probably that's in his book because I don't remember if Jerry was his daughter or his granddaughter. It might have been his granddaughter. Worked for Region 6. She was a staffer at Region 6 when Mort was dying and took over the book. And so she edited the book in a way that was much more compatible with the UAW, so that it didn't have all kinds of stuff in it that my father said, such important, information about how things work, really.
What happened to your father's papers? Did he have some? Do you have
He
them?
had some. Oh, it's terrible. That's another terrible story. So he got a Freedom of Information Act, 2 or 3 enormous, cartons filled with papers.
This is FBI stuff or secret intelligence stuff.
Yeah,
stuff.
and he got it in the 1960s. He didn't get it until the 1960s, whenever Freedom of Information Act came out, and so that had that box had also the movie from Emil Macy that had been a president, and so he gave them to me. At some point I got them, and then I was moving a lot, and I knew a guy who was a kind of a librarian and a lefty, and I asked him if he would keep those boxes for me for a few years. And he said, absolutely. And then he got a divorce, and his wife stole the boxes and said they were hers. And I've not been able to find her. So those papers are lost. So I filed a Freedom of Information Act thing, and I got, in fact, I could show it to you, but anyway, I got this much paper, like a ream of paper. Now, 3/4 of it were single space line that says page such and such redacted, page such and such redacted, page such and redacted, 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 you know, so a tremendous amount of papers redacted. So I called up the woman who was in charge of the file, and she said to me, she was a young Black woman. This was at the beginning of Barack's term. And so I thought, you know, I'll get this okay, right? And she said to me, she said 2 things to me, and one of the things she said to me, your father knew everybody, and everybody knew your father. And I was like, oh, really? Well, I don't know anything about that, you know. I'm trying to find out. And then she said, well, I just have the rules. I have to go by the rules. And I said, well, he got, you know, quite a lot of paper previously. And she said, I just have to go by the rules. And I didn't have the, as they say in Chinese medicine, the qi at the time to go after it, and don't have it anymore either. So his papers, you know,
they're floating around somewhere. Somebody's got them.
Or else they've, you know, gotten mildewed and thrown into a garbage bin or something. But
maybe not. Maybe a historian has them. Historians hoard stuff.
Yes, that's true. That's true. But
stuff away that should be properly, everybody should know about it.
Right.
They keep stuff because they're going to write a book themselves, right, or they intend to.
I'm trying to, my project that I have going, sort of, we just moved from California to North Carolina, which was an enormous lift. And, but thank God we did. Our good friends who are there now in 107-degree heat and smoke. I have bad lungs. So I said, we've got to get out of here. The drought is going to be persistent. The fires are awful. They're going to get worse. And, you know, we moved here in March, and so we're still unpacking and so on and so forth. But my project is to do a Wikipedia page on him. At least
that.
At least, but I mean that would be something that would, so that if he was referenced, people could look him up and see some things. And my ex-husband and I, when my dad died, we did a bunch of stuff, and we put out a memorial booklet, which lists like 47 locals that he organized.
Your father organized 47 locals?
Yeah.
During the CIO days?
Yeah.
I see.
Yeah.
And,
and this doesn't include whatever he did with John O. Lewis.
I suppose he was red baited out during the 50s or 60s.
Well, yeah, I mean, he, at some point in the 50s, when people were going underground and the Smith Act happened and people were going to trial for being communists, he couldn't get work. He couldn't get work in the 40s, actually, because even as a machinist, he was a machinist, and he would, even in a small machine shop, he'd get a job, and then the FBI would show up and he would lose his job. So it was a struggle. And I think that's true, you know, in the movie industry and where people were red baited out of work. Yeah. And I used to go around saying my father's a communist. You know, I was like 10 or something. And my mother would say, don't say that, you know, shh, shh. And I would be like, why? He is a communist, you know, why? Why, Mom? Am I supposed to lie? You know, I'd be.
It's so tragic that one of the greatest of the heroes of the period 1935 to 1947 had to experience that kind of a life
Yeah.
afterwards, instead of the plaudits that he deserved for his magnificent contribution.
Oh, it's so, it just warms my heart, Gene, for you to say those things, because he was loved by a lot of people who knew him directly, and then he was shunted aside and had no role, and it was very difficult to be. And I've experienced it myself, not the same way. Where in Chicago, I ran a local that was 10,000 people and did stuff, and then I got to California, and nobody knew who I was, and I was accustomed to saying things like, well, I think blah, 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 blah. And everybody would say, oh, well, yes, well, that's great. And they didn't know me from Adam. And I'd say, well, I think, and the people would say, well, I don't know, you know, who is she anyway? You know? So going from a place where you're recognized, and I was just recognized, he was loved, you know, to being shunted and shut down was tough, but he had good friends and used to play cards and laughed and would go fishing. And his third wife, my mother was his second wife. His first wife died. She was a sweetheart from Toledo, and she had cancer when she was very young. He died 40 years to the day on the day she died, which was struck me once I looked up her stuff. But the woman, the third wife, had some money, so they weren't paupers. I mean, he didn't have a lot of money to share. It was her money, so he didn't have a lot of money to share with my mother. So my mother was a working mother from very shortly after I was born.
I see.
But
We better cut this short.
It's too late for that.
We could do a dozen more and still not have talked
Right.
about the importance of Bob Travis in American labor history, and just in general, the fact that so much of American labor history is missing. This is Gene Lance on the Workers Beat. We'll be back.